Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. We called today's session Megadeals, Munitions, and Microchips, President Trump's Middle East mission. And indeed, we saw a week of megadeals that were focused largely on new arms sales arrangements and AI microchips. And we'll cover all of that today. But we'll also cover much more because this Middle East visit was all of that and more. We had a webinar last week with Ambassador Michael Ratney, and I started that webinar by reflecting on how much had happened last week in what felt like an eternity, and this week came in and did one even further in terms of just a absolute flurry of news developments as part of this rather historic and very consequential visit by President Trump to the Gulf this week. Of course, the week began with the really tremendous development of the release of Israeli-American hostage Idan Alexander, the last American hostage alive in Hamas captivity, was released in an arrangement that was struck by the United States, effectively engaging directly with Hamas to secure his release. And of course, President Trump visiting Saudi Arabia, announcing these mega deals, and surprising by meeting the new head of Syria and announcing the end of U.S. sanctions on Syria before continuing on to Qatar, where we saw more deals, and now in the United Arab Emirates. Throughout, there's been conversation on what this visit has meant for the United States foreign policy broadly towards the region, what it has meant for the U.S.-Israel relationship, with much commentary about the sidelining of Israel in the centrality of President Trump's focus in his meetings with the Gulf and the broader Arab world, the Saudis and the Emiratis, and the closeness with which he's developed those relations. We'll unpack all of that and more. And of course, it ends. We're now here discussing an ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, with the latest reports that Secretary Rubio has just called Prime Minister Netanyahu to express concern about the deteriorating humanitarian condition there, as there are negotiations taking place in Doha on a potential hostage release and ceasefire deal following the release of Idan Alexander. And if your head is spinning, I understand you, because these developments have been happening so fast and furious. But I have my terrific colleagues joining us today to help us unpack all of these developments and what they might mean for what next week might bring. As always, I encourage your questions throughout today's session. There won't be a Q&A. I'll take as many questions as I can throughout the conversation. You can ask your question by typing it using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. With me today are my colleagues Shira, Efron, and Michael Koplow. Shira, of course, our Director of Research at Israel Policy Forum and the Diane and Guilford Glazer Foundation Senior Fellow here at IPF. Michael Koplow is, of course, our Chief Policy Officer. Michael coming to us from Washington, and Shira based in the Tel Aviv area. Michael, I want to start with you from a perspective from Washington, before turning to Shira for views from Israel. First, thank you both for joining. Good to see you. Michael, view from Washington, what did we learn about President Trump, his approach to this region, and about American foreign policy going forward?
I don't think we learned anything new. I think a lot of what we thought we knew before has been confirmed. So, for starters, there is no question that President Trump likes the optics of going to the Gulf. He likes the optics of monarchy. He likes the fact that they have a lot of money to invest in the United States, and he's looking for wins. It's generally what he wants to do. He wants wins where he can get a very quick something that he can tout And this trip provides that for him in spades because he went over and immediately there was talk of the Saudis and the Qataris, and we haven't seen anything today out of the UAE, but I'm sure we'll see similar things where they talk about huge numbers of investment in the United States. Whether those actually come to fruition, I think is a is a fair question. For instance, when the Saudis promise to invest in or buy from the United States defense articles that are twice the amount of their annual defense budget. You have to you have to wonder if it's actually going to come through in that way. But the point is that there are these pledges that get made very quickly, and that's what the president likes. And he gets to avoid some of the messy things that he doesn't want to talk about. There hasn't been a lot of talk on this trip, at least from the Gulf states, about Russia, Ukraine. Of course, there has been some talk about the Gaza war, but really in no way, shape, or form has this trip been centered on that or focused on it, aside from the great news that you noted at the beginning, which was the release of Idan Alexander. So the president gets to talk about the things that he likes. And for all the talk about President Trump being a transactional guy, this really is laying that out in an important way. I think the other thing that's important is that it isn't just about transactionalism. I think that we heard President Trump really distill his foreign policy and his view of the world when he talked about the fact that the United States should not be judging other countries based on their values or the things that
I apologize. We have a siren, so I'll be back with you in 10 minutes. I'm sorry.
the things that they're doing right or the things that they're doing wrong. That's I think that's an important component of the way he approaches the world. And when he talks about interests instead of values, and when he emphasizes that he in many ways views foreign policy as another aspect of the corporate world, he's talking about commerce and transactions and emphasizing those things versus emphasizing things like security architecture or combating threats. I think it stems from what we know about him. And so in terms of what we expected, I don't there were, I'm sure we'll talk about specific policy issues that came up that weren't necessarily assured ahead of time, such as Syria sanctions, and a few others. But I think in general, this really is President Trump's view of the world playing out in terms of the things that he talked about, in terms of what he's coming home with, and frankly, in terms of the countries that he decided to visit.
So, Shira having to go to the shelter is yet another reminder of the way in which the conversation over the last week has been discussed about how does Israel fit into all of this. And obviously the deal that President Trump struck last week with the Houthis to stop the targeting of ships in the Red Sea did not cover Israel. I'm seeing across social media that the attack that there is a rocket launch coming from the Houthis. That is why Shira is heading into the shelter now. Michael, what have you made of what? First of all, unpack for us what you have seen in terms of how the Israelis are viewing this trip, and a little bit about what you wrote this week in your column as to how should Israelis be engaging Trump going forward.
I think it's maybe an understatement to say that there's a lot of angst in Israel from Israelis across the board. It isn't just from the government. Israelis had this view that, and we've seen it in so many ways, that President Trump is the most pro-Israel president in history, and he's going to let Israel do pretty much anything it wants. And once he's president, we're going to see maximum pressure on Iran and no pressure coming on the Israeli government about anything they're doing in Gaza. Unfettered flow of weapons, not a word about humanitarian assistance, no pressure to get to a ceasefire. All these things that, and certainly on the within the Bezalel Smotrich camp, almost jubilation, right? Stating that 2025 is going to be the year of sovereignty, referring to the West Bank. So there were these wild expectations, and certainly they have not been borne out. And now you start to see, particularly in corners of the Israeli right that are very much in Bibi Netanyahu's camp, whether it be Channel 14 or some of the more famous social media personalities who support him. You now see this idea that President Trump has abandoned Israel, or that now he has to be combated. And even you see articles now in the Israeli press saying that, oh, this is a good thing, that there are these disagreements, because it shows that the Israeli government is going to stand up to Trump. Um, and what I wrote today was that I think that both of these views are wrong. He was never the most unabashed pro-Israel president in history by inclination, and he's not anti-Israel now. He likes things that give him easy wins, and right now Israel doesn't do that. If you're President Trump and you're looking for hundreds of billions, if not $1 trillion of investment inside of the United States, that's not coming from Israel. That's coming from Gulf sovereign wealth funds and Gulf companies that have the capacity to invest in those kinds of numbers. You absolutely don't want to wade into the Gaza conflicts, especially once it became clear that there is no easy fix on day one, that there wasn't going to be an agreement on day one to end the war, that Hamas is not going to just be simply eliminated. And then of course there's the Iran issue, where this is where I think President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu have been on a collision course pretty much from the beginning. When President Trump took office on day one, he was pretty clear he wanted to explore the possibility of an Iran deal. And any Iran deal was never going to be full dismantlement of the program, of their nuclear program. It was going to be preventing them from getting a nuclear weapon, and verifying in basically all the same ways that the JCPOA did that they aren't working on a nuclear weapon. But it was always going to have some sort of civilian nuclear enrichment component. And that goes against what Prime Minister Netanyahu has laid down as his standard. So this collision course was there, and it's not because President Trump is a different guy this time around, or because somehow the countries have changed the views of the world. I think what Israel wanted last time fit very well into what President Trump wanted, and what Israel wants this time does not. And so that's what we're seeing. And I think that I think the Israelis who are freaking out need to take a deep breath, understand that there are still many ways, obviously, in which the United States and Israel are aligned, many ways in which President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu are aligned. And there's something that could almost only happen in Israel, where the Prime Minister has been to DC to meet with the president twice in the first 100 days, and U.S. officials are there constantly. And Steve Witkoff is literally taking his deceased son's Magen David off of his neck and giving it to an Israeli hostage, and yet somehow Israelis are talking about this as if the apocalypse is here, that the greatest friend Israel has ever known is now abandoning Israel. So I think that there's a lot of high emotions on all sides, but from my vantage point, it's not that difficult to understand what's going on.
Yeah. I just want to remind folks, if you have a question, to pop in at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Shira, welcome back.
Thank you.
Glad to see you're back safely. We were just reminded by the lack of Israel's inclusion in the deal, as we have another rocket launch from the Houthis. And Michael was just unpacking a bit of the response from Israel. But Shira, I wonder if you could, you didn't hear what Michael had to say, but what is your take on the reaction from Israel, both the political and security thinking about Trump's visit and what it might mean from the Israeli viewpoint going forward?
I think I didn't hear what Michael had to say, but I'm pretty sure I know what he said. Because I think looking at this with cleared eyes initially, and anticipating what this administration is going to do and the way this trip was planned, I think, we can be, I was surprised at the audacity of some of the things, right? But like overall, the directions, the decisions were not surprising. And the surprise to me, and many in Israel are surprised, in fact. So it began before the trip, right? We had Netanyahu visiting Washington the first time, right? First visit, first international leader to visit, coming back with the Minister for Strategic Affairs. His closest confidant is, the son he always wished he had, very close relationship. Someone who was Israeli ambassador to Washington, someone who basically knows Washington, is Mr. Washington in Israel. And they came back, and it was reflected all over. Everyone who met them both said that there's really just like a sense of hubris that they own Washington, that they're going to make this administration do anything they want. And I'm fairly close with the defense establishment. There were a lot of discussions on we can now shut down the gates to Gaza. No one's going to care about the humanitarian issues. They're going to let us like strike Iran, right? Like anything where this government, which I don't think it's the Israeli interest, right? But any direction the Israeli government wanted to take, they just assume they will have a carte blanche to do it. Then comes the second visit to Washington, which was really not planned at all, right? There was the tariffs, and all of a sudden, and Netanyahu goes there non-planned, and there wasn't even a positive spin. It was very clear that there, even though Israel was not surprised, they were aware, negotiations with Iran, right? And a few other issues, some sort of remark that was like, I think it was like sort of mazel tov on the military assistance. And it was very clear that Israel, when you thought who owned who, right? In Hebrew, you would say like they're in their back pocket. It was very clear it was the other way around. Then a few days before the visit, we heard that Ron Dermer himself received a meeting with the president, which is on the one hand is indicative of the special relationship that Israel has in Washington, right? What other countries get two prime minister visits and a strategic affairs minister to go in and talk to the president? On the other hand, leaks on both sides of the ocean indicated this meeting was was not a good meeting. And the meeting indicated that the president was losing his patience with Israel and with its approach to everything. So then comes this visit, fast forward. And and then before that, we had the decision on Yemen and the Houthis. Michael and I were in the Gulf a month and a half ago, and there was a U.S. official that spoke about this campaign. I asked the question about how aligned this campaign and the effort with the objectives, and he was very he was very not kind to.
Meaning the future Israeli campaign,
No, on the U.S. campaign to commitment on the Houthis, and he dismissed me that I don't know anything about military operations in front of everyone, right? That it's not a time-bound effort, and they're committed. It was very clearly that they're not committed to put in the resources, right? And this was all reports indicated. But Israel did not expect to be thrown under the bus like that, right? So all the sort of like indications were there, and then of course came the visit with Israel. I think. The first thing that sort of struck Israel by surprise is the delinkage of all these goodies, right, that partners in the Gulf got. And it's not the first time they received those goodies, but, F-35s to the UAE, which they haven't received till this day, but at least was in connection to normalization with Israel, right? Now it's like Turkey, Saudi, I don't know who else is getting. I mean, we'll see. We'll see if anyone gets it, but the promises are there. So the whole concept of Israeli qualitative military edge, QME, is basically down. Then we have the continued reports on Iran with the draft agreement, the Houthis, obviously. On the energy deals with Saudi Arabia, the details are not out on the nuclear part, but about a month ago, Energy Secretary Wright did sign some sort of an agreement on a nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia, which again, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it was always linked with Israeli with normalization with Israel. And another one, and I think this is the most illustrative one, it's Syria, right? Because what happened here, Shira al-Jilani, Syria's leader, in the early, and I'm sorry, I hope I'm not repeating anything Michael said, but early on when he became, right after Assad was toppled, he bent his back, backwards to signal through Israel and to Israel that he's not heading to war, and through Israel, or basically through this like overtures towards Israel to reach Washington. But now he went to the Gulf, and in Israel, it's interpreted as sort of like Israel used to be the gateway of Arabs to Washington. And now the gateway is Mohammed bin Salman and the Gulf partners. And Israel just feels like they're not there. Now on Syria, my views are that it's important to give Syria a chance and not do this through the prism of risks only. But I would have thought that a more reasonable policy wouldn't be just like on the whim, right? To like, let's say we remove policies, let's tie this into some sort of commitments. Let's tie this. And obviously, this is not what's happening. And I think Israel is also sort of everyone is on hold period of what is going to come in terms of will there be pressure to end the war, no pressure to end the war. I have my views on this. I don't think we're going to see pressure or pressure to end the war, but there's going to be something. Idan Alexander was also something that, I mean, we all had been speaking about it for a long, long time. So no surprise there. But Israelis were surprised at how Trump can go about just releasing or going just over a U.S. citizen. But I think mostly what's interpreted here in Israel is sort of like, how could we have lost our position? It's, of course, our voice is heard, but with Mike Waltz, who was sort of like perceived as the Israeli extension in the White House, being out of his role as national security advisor, there's a sense of Israel of a downgrading of its importance. And I have not met with the prime minister, but I've heard from people who see him in cabinet decisions, and they say that the impact is very noticeable, that he's not himself. So I think this is it's making a mark in terms of, there's a real effect on the sentiment here. It's not just pundits and, others, policy wonks talking about it. It's felt by the decision makers also.
Sure. I want to push you a bit to comment on your views about there not being an end to the war, because we've seen President Trump in recent days, talk about returning all of the hostages. We've seen, as Michael described earlier, Steve Witkoff's personal commitment and continued statements that it is not just that Idan Alexander, only because he's American, that the United States is committed to bringing all of the hostages home. And of course, doing so really requires an end to the war. The hostage negotiations were effectively stuck or non-existent until the Idan Alexander deal struck, and we have renewed negotiations in Doha. But of course, we know that an end to the war comes up against Netanyahu's political interest to save his government. How do you see this playing out? Particularly as, again, just last week, we had this not insignificant, very significant buildup of both rhetoric and actions by the Israeli military preparing for this new operation. Will we see that operation? The messaging was that this military operation would begin at the end or after President Trump's to the region. What do you expect we will see going forward? A deal, more momentum, or is it? Are we going to see a significant operation in the days to come?
Look, I don't have a crystal ball, and it's hard to read the tea leaves. All preparations are for a major operation. There have been a lot of military strikes, especially around hospitals. Hospitals, I know, are perceived as not legitimate target. The problem is that they're really abused by Hamas, not just to hide terrorists, they're also the recruitment and training centers of their new recruits. So in the Israeli sense, from an Israeli perspective, they are a legitimate target, but we're seeing intensive strikes today. There have been warrants, they recruited reservists, and sort of like there is a credible threat of invasion. My sense was that Trump basically told Israel, don't, until he comes back from the region. And on top of that, there is an Arab League summit in Baghdad on the 17th. So we're talking about sort of the 18th. Next day was, so we have a few more days. It is my feeling, and it could be wishful thinking, but sort of just like reading the tea leaves and trying to connect the dots between what's going on. I doubt that we're going to see the major 5 division going into Gaza on Sunday with the goal of occupying it, and an operation supposed to continue for at least 1 year. Right, the idea is that occupying Gaza will take 1 year, and then scanning through the surfaces will take 3 months, and then another 9 months to scan through all of Gaza. And I would be very surprised. I'm hearing, and again, this is all through different people, that Witkoff essentially is not ready to pressure Israel for the full deal. So I think where we are, and this is what the government is talking about, is sort of the Witkoff model. Now, Witkoff model, we can talk about different interpretations, right? If you recall, I think about a month ago or I don't know. At some point, Witkoff, Hamas says we will release 5 hostages. Israel said not less than 10, and Idan Alexander needs to be the 11th. We will not compromise for less. Some people are talking about Witkoff plus. Again, no crystal ball here. I wouldn't be surprised if it's like a Witkoff minus from the Israeli perspective, that now because Hamas showed good graces and released Idan Alexander without anything, that there will be pressure on Israel to settle for less living hostages and less bodies. And we can go into the different specifics of this model for some ceasefire, which with the hope of all parties that it could be extended. This is something that I think this is something that if Netanyahu says, we have to, Trump forced our hands, we have no choice, even though a few weeks ago he said no, and we're still going to go to war, and we don't have to send the end of the war. This to me is a plausible scenario, but so much of it depends on what comes from Washington. And it's very clear. Steve Witkoff himself said that as long as this war continues, the region is not financeable. We know war is bad for business. Trump says it himself. He must have heard it from others. I don't think Gaza was top priority of his visit, but he's in the UAE now. So I think we're in the world again of sort of a piecemeal agreement, ceasefire. I don't see the big end of war, but I'm optimistic that we're not seeing the alternative, which is a full Israeli occupation of Gaza. But again, this might not age well next week, so take it with a
Michael,
grain of salt.
so we're getting you all on record on what's going to happen next week. Michael, what's your take? Can Trump really push Netanyahu to do what he has thus far been so opposed to doing, which is bring all the hostages home through a deal that would end the war?
I think he probably can, but I don't think we yet know if he's inclined to. If he really wants to lean on Netanyahu and tell him that he must accept something along those lines, then I think Netanyahu has ways of working within those confines, whether it means trying to call a quick election or whether it means taking advantage of the evergreen offer from Yair Lapid and Benny Gantz to shore up his government in order to see a hostage agreement and a ceasefire through. So it doesn't have to mean that he falls from power. It almost certainly will mean the end of his current coalition as constituted. But if the president sits on his head, then he can probably work with that and figure out a way to stay afloat politically. But to me, it's an open question whether Trump actually wants to do that. And I think we see these different impulses, right? He kind of moves around. I mean, there was a point where obviously he was pressing very hard on a hostage deal and ceasefire. But then instead of really pressing Netanyahu, he effectively went behind his back to just get Idan Alexander out. And he's spent now the week in the Gulf where you can even tell it from his public rhetoric. He's obviously been hearing from them behind closed doors about how they want to see the war end, and how he's got to get the Israelis to be more flexible. But on the other hand, he'll leave the Gulf and he'll come back home and he'll be onto something else. And so Netanyahu may be able to just ride it out. I think that the problem for the Israelis is the same problem everybody has with Trump, which is that he's completely unpredictable and you never know what he's going to do or say or how he's going to react to anything. So, if you're the Israelis and a month ago you thought that you had this complete green light from the White House to enact this new war plan that the Security Cabinet approved, and now a few weeks later, all of a sudden it seems like maybe if you do that, the president will be upset. You're not entirely sure what to do. And so I agree with Shira that it seems a lot more likely to me that there's going to be some sort of halfway measure, not the full blown Israeli effectively scorched earth campaign, and also not a comprehensive deal that ends the war and gets everybody out. But I'm not that confident that there will even be kind of a skinny deal. I think that really will depend on how much pressure the president puts on the Israelis, and whether Netanyahu thinks that he actually has to give him something in order to avoid a greater blow from Trump. I worry that the likeliest scenario is things continue as they have, and the hostages remain, and Israel ramps up its war in Gaza, but not in the full way that they were threatening, and we kind of limp along for another few months before some other inflection point happens, and we go through all this again.
So
Also, one thing I do want to note is, when you see just what the president said today, um, and this is what I mean about kind of that you can see and hear the influence of what people are saying to him. On his way to the UAE, somebody asked him about what it means that he didn't go to Israel, and if they should take that as a signal. He said, "No, it's a good thing for Israel that I have good relationships with these other countries," as if everything that the Israelis want to get has to flow through him. And he also made a comment which really, I think, puts a spin on the Israeli spin that a military campaign will get the hostages out. He said something to the effect of, the only reason that there are hostages alive is because of me, because of the United States. I don't know what he meant by the only reason the hostages are alive. I suspect what he meant was the only reason there are hostages, living hostages who are coming out, is because of the United States. But there too, if you're the Israelis, you have to look at that and wonder what he was being told behind closed doors, and wonder how he's going to react to that, because he kind of seems to be metaphorically blowing up Israeli claims in real time.
So one of the issues that really has been in the news this morning is this Secretary Rubio call with Prime Minister Netanyahu on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. This follows reports that there would be a resumption of aid to Gaza using the channels that have been utilized up until now. Of course, the aid has been frozen since the collapse of the last ceasefire, and we have seen the reports of the creation of a new mechanism called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that is sort of overseen or developed by the Trump administration in coordination with the Israelis. Shira, could you help us make sense of the humanitarian situation in Gaza today, what we have seen from the administration thus far on this new mechanism? I know this is a whole knot, and the reality is, between this and Syria and Iran and Saudi and all of the rest, we need each one of these to be podcasts or webinars. But Shira, if you could give us a view of the humanitarian situation today and what the administration has been signaling that it wants to do here.
Okay, it's quite complex, and some things they're sensitive, so I need to be cautious in terms of what I say and how to explain this. So I think, first of all, this is the 74th day that assistance has not gone into Gaza. And I think everyone needs to understand this. We're talking about a very severe situation. I had never thought it would go so long. I really thought that it would be, my bet was 60 days. because you did hear, even though the Israeli, after the ceasefire broke, or after Israel made the ceasefire collapse, right? It was the Israeli side that decided it ended. There were different assessments, and there was a public position by Israel that, oh, there's enough supplies in Israel for 6 months. But inside closed rooms, people were talking about 60 days. Whereas the UN and other NGOs said, 2 weeks, I don't know, 3 weeks. So we said probably the truth is somewhere in the middle, but Israel will go for the full 60 days. There were some people say like 75 days. We're at 74 days now, which to me, I think it's, I don't know if it's a collective failure. I'm encouraged to hear that Secretary Rubio cares about the situation. I think this is something that, Americans and others should have cared about before, because even if during the ceasefire, which was 42 days long, and 4,200 trucks went in every week, and this, we're not going to go into the weeds. We don't really know how much food of what quality was there, and definitely anything that was perishable, medical supplies, fuel and you need fuel for everything because everything works on generators, right? So for water purification stuff. So anyway, and to me, even though, we're a Jewish organization and we all care about the hostages, I mean, to me, even just looking at the last video of Elkanah Buchbut, and, you see two hostages, and there was a video of a month before and a month now, and it's very clear that they're so much thinner, right? Like even our people and hostages that came back said that in periods where there was less food in Gaza, they ate less. So, but if you ask a lot of Israelis, there's no humanitarian crisis in Gaza, there's still no hunger. This is something I'm hearing every day. We're not seeing children dying of hunger. So I will just say, like, this is a mindset here that there's still time. Within sort of closed rooms, people are saying it's rushing and we will have to bring aid in. I don't know that I can't tell you that the cabinet approved aid going in unless it's through the new model. Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is a new creation that was announced within the last week or so. There were leaks before. It's connected to another entity, which is called SRS. SRS is sort of the security company that's supposed to build those distribution centers and have security folks distributing aid out of several distribution centers. It's the same company that helped with the ceasefire, doing the inspections at the interim corridor, if you all remember, going back and start. And the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation was supposed to take care of sort of like the actual assistance that goes in. The original model spoke about, we will start with 4 distribution centers. There will be mostly in southern Gaza. In the paper, in the document, the Gaza GHF, it's called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It's a document that was leaked. They said that they will provide aid for 1.2 million people. And with this, the idea was that the U.S. administration would sort of like take custodianship over this mechanism. They won't pay anything, but they will, I will be kind with my words, they will encourage the UN and NGOs to play ball and support it. I can go on for hours about how problematic this is. The UN basically said absolutely not. They expressed a uniform position, like I haven't seen them even around the UNRWA issue. Because they're saying this is contradictory to all humanitarian principles. Humanitarian principles is that we bring the aid to the people. We don't have them come to a distribution center. Plus, it's 1.2 million people. What about the other million? What about North? What about this? If there are questions, we can really do a whole webinar on that. What happened that because of all these leaks that were out, because of the criticism, and because of the United Front of the UN and other NGOs, the big ones said, we're not complicit with this, we're not cooperating with this, and the lack of funding, really, you need donors. I was happy to see last night that GHF came up with a sort of a new model where they're basically saying, and I mean, it's interesting who says what, but GHF is saying we have demanded things of Israel and Israel agreed. When basically they're talking about much more of a gradual approach to cover all of Gaza, to make sure the missing parts of it, because they're talking about aid to the individual, right? We will bring you your box, which will have the dry pasta, the sugar, the da 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 da. But if you don't have a community kitchen operated by the UN to cook it, what are you going to do with your pasta? Cook it, what, I don't know, play in your tent? There's no, there needs to be, Gaza's population is 100% dependent on aid. Without private sector, without the UN, this model was just not going to work. So there seems to me, and I think we're really in the first day of this, that there could be an opening for the compromise that GHF and the claim that GHF makes, that claims that Israel is willing to make a compromise. And I hope that the UN and NGOs can make a compromise too, and we can find some sort of a solution to gradually maybe resume transition into or explore new modalities of aid going in, which will prevent Hamas from exploiting the aid the way that it did before, but also ensure ample assistance for the people of Gaza. For that, you need more functional relationship between Israel and the UN, which we don't have. But I'm a little bit more optimistic today than I was 3 days ago.
So yeah, we've had a lot of questions about that humanitarian situation, and I agree that this is going to be the subject of future webinars, I'm sure, because this situation it seems to be this concept, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF, that you've been referencing. It seems like this is the only beginning. It's sort of public coming out moment, and it may be a part of the landscape now going forward. Lots of questions, of course, about what, if anything, amidst pressure on Netanyahu might precipitate elections. Michael, I want to bring you in. This kind of goes back to the question of Trump's ability to press Netanyahu into making steps that he might not otherwise be prepared to make. Lots of questions that have come in about what could force Bibi into new elections, and if Trump would actually be able to push him in a way that would precipitate those elections.
It's possible, but as I mentioned earlier, I think that he probably has an out before elections, which is getting some of the opposition folks to come and let the government continue to operate as long as it's seeing through a hostage and ceasefire deal. And I see today that Ehud Barak is already tweeting out warnings that Benny Gantz is gonna go and in the Israeli euphemism, get under the stretcher, and give Netanyahu kind of another lifeline. So he does have other options. If he decides to call an election, then he would probably want to do it ASAP, because really the only chance he has of getting through that election to the other side is a stalemate. And the only chance he has of getting a stalemate is if Naftali Bennett isn't yet prepared to really take advantage of jumping in. Naftali Bennett is ahead in all the polls. He has formed a party, but I don't know that he's quite put together yet all the extensive apparatus he would need to really take full advantage. And so if he can kind of catch Naftali Bennett not completely prepared, then maybe he can get to a point where this coalition has no chance of getting an actual majority. But if he can get to a point where the opposition is also at 60 seats or lower before they incorporate any of the Arab parties, then maybe he gets a stalemate, and he lives to see yet another election. Because of course, as people will remember, after having now seen this a bunch of times since 2019, if there's a stalemate, the current prime minister and the current government continue until the next election. So it's possible. There's no question that he's extremely sensitive to President Trump and to President Trump's ability to turn on people. We talk all the time about the Zelensky Oval Office meeting. Netanyahu absolutely wants to avoid something like that. He doesn't want President Trump out there tweeting about him. He doesn't want President Trump, making comments about him being a problem. So he's going to do anything he can to avoid that. And um, my guess is that his first instinct is going to be to do what he always does, which is kind of draw a process out. So we already saw that he sent negotiators to Doha this week, something that I'm sure he didn't really want to do, but he did it because he thought that he needed to mollify the White House in some way. And I think he'll probably continue to do that sort of thing and draw out negotiations and try to get to a point where he can get the United States to conclude that there's nothing more that Israel can do, that at this point it's on Hamas. I think that's going to be tougher. Going to be tougher, I think, with this White House that has less patience for everybody. And I think it's going to be tougher in the wake of President Trump's to the region this week. But I'm sure that's what he's going to try to do. But ultimately, if he has to go to elections, he will do whatever he can to try and swing them in his favor.
And we have a couple questions that have come in about the Haredi draft bill and whether that, in the context of the potential for increased military action by the Israelis in Gaza, would be another source of potential strain in the political system. I'm curious for you both, your thoughts on the state of that issue.
It's already a source of strain, and the Haredim are threatening to not vote for any government bills until it gets resolved, and some of them are threatening to leave the government. Ultimately, I don't buy the Haredi threats for the simple fact that they aren't going to be the next government unless it's a government that looks like this. They're not going to be in a government that looks like the Bennett Lapid government from last time if that gets put together, meaning the current opposition. If you think, and I'm a little bit in this camp, if you think that Naftali Bennett, if he was the top vote getter, rather than trying to reform the last coalition, would turn to Likud and try to form a right-wing coalition, that would be a right-wing coalition that would also keep the Haredi parties out. So there's really no world in which they do better if there's an election. So they're clearly trying to pressure Netanyahu, but and even if they decide that they're not going to vote for private member bills, which is their current position, until the draft issue gets resolved in a way that they like, very hard for me to see them actually forcing elections and bringing the government down.
Shira, your thoughts on the Haredi draft, but specifically also just the state of, in the wake of Trump's visit and the expectation of this Israeli operation that has been talked about in Gaza, the call up of reservists, are people prepared for another round? I have multiple questions about what is the goal? Is it indeed to reoccupy Gaza, and how have we gotten to this point, the shift of our goal is not to remain in Gaza, to now talking about sort of these long-term, the goals of staying long-term. What has been the impact on reservists? How does the Haredi draft? I'm curious if you could just speak to the sense in Israel about what are the goals and how is the security establishment and the recruiting of soldiers impacted by all of this?
Then, I mean, the Israeli public after this war is exhausted, and the war continues, right? People are getting drafted now in the fifth time. The people who are, my age, in their 40s, people in their 30s, people with families. We're talking about thousands and thousands of soldiers that are being called again and again and again. And you need to remember that for the most part, Israelis are very disciplined, right? Like, you're being called, you go. So when you ask the question, why do you go? So I just spoke with someone the other day, and he said, I have 22 troops, and I had to call them, each one of them, because none of them wanted to come. And I had to convince them to show up. So of course I have to show up because I had to convince them, so it's a system, and it's not people who support the policy of this government. They're not even sure what this operation is going to be, but they're not going to refuse. You're being called to serve. And they hope that the statements of the politicians are mostly just statements. They hope that the idea is not to occupy Gaza. And it's more like it's a combination of, I don't know if it's like refusing to see reality for what it is, just being disciplined, comradeship amongst, sort of idea of soldiers, units, reserves, and also need to remember that many of the reservists that are being called to other fronts where those in compulsory service will go to Gaza, which is also part of this sort of like, how do you address this? But there's a sense, and this is why the Haredi draft is such an issue. When the IDF has a shortage of 12,000 combatants. I don't have the numbers in front of me, and I don't want to sabotage the statistics, but if you look at the alarming numbers of injuries, casualties, PTSDs, we just had yesterday a police officer that fought on October 7 committed suicide, and he's number 3, and this is police, right? Not IDF in just a few months, and there are more. There's no capacity, and many people know that this could be the descendants of the hostages, which is supposed to be the goal. So there's real frustration. In addition to higher inflation, we look at price increases. Today, there was just a report of prices that continue to increase, thanks to the Houthis firing at us. They fired exactly the same, but there was a missed interception. So there's now a big hole by the Ben Gurion airport. So again, we have an aviation closure, right? Again, you're sort of like stuck here. It's very difficult, and at a time where I think objectively, if you look at the strategic position, right, a lot thanks to Israeli military activities, right, Hamas no longer poses the threat to Israel that it did, not even close, right? And Hamas also, let's see if we believe them or not, but they're willing to give up their options of disarmament. I'm not saying any of that will be easy, but Hamas is not the threat it used to be. Hezbollah is decimated, not done for, but to have Joseph Aoun as the president of Lebanon, I mean, it's an Israeli fantasy, right? Shira is talking about normalization with Israel. Iran, it's on its back, right? I mean, the strategic position could have been, should have been celebrated, right? Israel should be welcome to this world, and Israel needs, when we talk about sort of like reform, reconstruction, rehabilitation, recovery, Israel needs that itself. So it's as you both know, and I'm sure some of our listeners who visit here, it's those are difficult times, and I think that if the war, unlike what I think, but if the war does happen and we go into full invasion, there's going to be a real crisis in Israel, because the mainstream, I'm not talking about Channel 14, right, the Israeli Newsmax, but the mainstream Israel understands this is the objectives of this war and what's going to achieve at the end, to no end.
Michael, we have some questions about Abbas. There were some reports that Abbas was going to fly to Saudi Arabia. Ultimately, there was no meeting with Abbas and Donald Trump. We should note there was a terrorist attack in the West Bank just yesterday, killing a pregnant woman. Shira mentioned the multiple fronts that Israel's facing, and we obviously see more IDF presence in the West Bank than we've seen in many years. What do you make of the state of the PA not being a part of the dialogue, or Abbas not being a part of these conversations? Do you make note of any of that?
I think it would have been impossible for the president to meet with Abbas, even in the Gulf, without meeting with Netanyahu or going to Israel. So, not surprising to me that ultimately he wasn't there. I do think it's really important to note, though, that Abbas's stock in the Gulf is up, without question. His new official number 2, Hussein al-Sheikh, who for a long time has been the most powerful non-Abbas person in Palestinian politics, in the last few weeks, has not only been to Saudi Arabia to meet with the Saudi leadership, but has also been to the UAE to meet with the Emirati leadership. And there were pictures just from right before President Trump got to the Gulf of ABZ, the Emirati foreign minister, sitting there with Hussein al-Sheikh. So the PA is all of a sudden being included in many of these discussions in the Gulf, and it may be because the Gulf states sense that President Trump at some point is going to force a resolution, and they understand that if that happens, if they want to get rid of Hamas, and I think that they all, let's leave the Qataris aside for a moment, but certainly the Saudis and the Emiratis want to get rid of Hamas, then there is no other address than the PA, something that we've been saying here for a year and a half. And I also think that there's a recognition in some of these states that as much as they may not like the PA and they may not like Abbas, that's who's there. Abbas, uh, he could drop dead tomorrow, or he could live for another 10 years. Nobody knows, but for the time being, he's there, and his grip on things is as strong as it's ever been. So in some ways, if you want to have any influence in the PA, you have to accept the fact that he is there, and you have to work with him. And so I think that we see his stock and the PA stock rising with the Gulf states, and I don't see that ending anytime soon. I think that the effort that we saw pretty early on after October 7th, where the Gulf states, really not just the Gulf states, but all the Sunni states coalesced around this idea that the PA had to have some role, and then for a while maybe the PA stock was down. I think it's back up, and as they seem to sense that maybe there's now a resolution coming from President Trump, they want the PA involved, and they also want to be themselves involved in the PA so that they can shape what happens.
Yeah,
At the risk
I want to
oh,
add,
sorry.
sorry, no, I just want to add to this, because I think for a long time, when we spoke about the Emiratis specifically, he had a sort of more of a maximalist position, and the Saudis also are not fans of Abbas, but the UAE in particular was like, until he's gone, nothing can happen. They had very specific demands for who they think should be the Palestinian leader. We're not in this world anymore. I think there's a realization that because we had put a plug in for a report that I had great co-authors that led the effort, and I was on it too, on PA reform. But we received feedback from those countries. I say, we realize that we will push for maximal reforms under Abbas, and hopefully that will propel a change in the future. We have Saudi resuming funding to the PA, and this is a major shift. And I'll just say about Hussein al-Sheikh, I mean, he draws his power from being Abbas's confidant, but he's like Israel's guy. Everyone in Israel talks to him, so that's where I think there's tension, and there's so many opportunities here for Israel also, right? Because if everyone sort of coalesces around the PA, but everyone understands it needs to have to undergo meaningful reforms, that's where, and reforms are really in the eye of the beholder. Every entity has different view on what reforms mean. This is where Israel should have this dialogue or conversation with the different partners and ensure that its demands for reforms are included in this conversation. And this is again a front where I think the Israelis are missing out on this. And by the way, and this goes into the connection of whether we're going to have a military occupation or not. Israelis are saying an area that we took over, we occupied, we're not going to release it. I don't know how this vibes with Hamas's demands, but if Israel, and I do agree that even if we go for a ceasefire and an end of war, that Israel will remain sort of in charge on the big security of Gaza for a long time to come, right? Like in the West Bank, in a sense. I know of only one entity in the world that knows how to coexist with Israeli occupation, and that is the PA. So I just don't know, but this, of course, is not something that we can even talk about currently in Jerusalem. And it will not happen voluntarily also, even if we had Naftali Bennett here, I think, as a prime minister. But it really depends of what President Trump does. And even though it's not his priority, hopefully his partners and new and best friends tell him that.
So we're over time, but I'm going to go over time if that's all right with you two, because I think there's been so many questions on so many issues that I feel like if we don't cover these two that have come up repeatedly, it would be wrong. And so I really think we can go a little bit over time today, because there's two sort of themes. One is on Hamas and its future, and the other is on the future of the U.S.-Israel relationship. And I think with that we can come to a close. But the first is on Hamas, and we have questions from a number of people, including our friends Dan Rotem and Laura Rosen. Dan writes, now after the trip, how receptive is the Trump administration to the argument that military action alone cannot do away with Hamas and that you need an integrated campaign, including alternative political governance arrangements to remove them from effective power? There are many questions in my feed about what does it mean, Hamas disarmaments towards an end to the war. And Laura adds, if there is a ceasefire, can we expect the attacks from the Houthis to stop? Michael, do you want to jump in and then share?
Yeah, I can start. So on that last part, no way of knowing for sure, but the evidence we have is that the Houthis stopped firing at Israel during ceasefires. We've now seen that twice. So I don't know that it'll last forever, right? But that does seem to, at least over the last year and a half, be the only really effective way of getting them to stop. As for the rest of it, as I noted earlier, Trump basically said today that it isn't military pressure that gets the hostages back. It's the United States negotiating that gets the hostages back, and it will not surprise me if he also comes to the conclusion after spending a week in the Gulf that there isn't necessarily a military solution to Hamas. He's seen the Israeli campaign now for over a year and a half, and Hamas is still there, and he's obviously very much aware of that. And no way of knowing whether he still takes Israeli claims about this at face value, but it definitely would not surprise me if he concludes, as he has in other spots, including in Yemen, that military campaigns can only go so far, and that ultimately you need to have some sort of political arrangement to deal with the problem.
Shira,
Yeah, I
anything you want to add?
agree with Michael on this. I think whether the Trump administration knows the details and looks into the complex question of DDR, lessons learned from other places, what it will require, I doubt it. It's not an easy question, right? I think when we also talk, and again, in conversations I had with Arab officials, when they talk about disarmament of Hamas, and you ask them what does it entail, like, we will take care of it. There are some ways to do that, but I think the devil is in the details. And as our friend Dan Rotem knows, there are different ways for doing this, and they're not foolproof. And how does it work? There is a high anticipation in Israel, and I did hear that this is something that Witkoff is also sort of, everyone is looking to see if Israel indeed killed Hamas Sinwar. And some people who are supposed to be the hardliners inside Gaza, who are the hardliners when it comes to a negotiation agreement. So this could also, by the way, David, when you talk about sort of like when will this military operation resume or go into full force, this is also something, until we have the clear details of this, the killing attempt of this leadership, it'll be hard to, because my understanding is that if Sinwar is really dead, how does Hamas regroup, and do we see a different constellation? You do read, different Hamas. We have statements. We have an interview with Musab Abu Marzouk in the New York Times talking about a willingness to give up, of course, Gaza. There is talk also about whether they're going to go for a hudna, longer ceasefire, promise not to rearm. Different questions whether we believe Hamas or not, but there's clearly no other place in the world where this could be only achieved via military means. And we know, and I'm sorry to sound cynical about this, but we know that for the moment, the replenishment rate, right, the pace with which Hamas recruits people is faster than the pace with which Israel kills the Hamas militants. So that's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Michael, Shira, final words on the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship. A number of questions about the concept of shared values and the notable absence of any discussion of American values or democratic values across Trump's visit, and the absence of that discourse today, and the conversation about U.S.-Israel relationship, and the question about many questions, right, about the MOU and about the broad nature of the future of U.S.-Israel relations. Does this trip signal a profound change or not? Michael and Shira, final word.
I don't know if the trip itself signifies a profound change. You know, there's there's an irony in that the perceived gap in shared values, and we saw it, you know, in a lot of the struggle between the Biden administration and this Israeli government. You know, it's a problem under Democrats, right? As Trump stated very clearly, he's not in the business of moralizing and telling countries how they should behave, and values don't come into it at all. But in the long run, you know, the fact that President Trump seems to want to take values out of the relationship entirely, that's what's going to destroy the U.S. Israel quote unquote special relationship. Because as we all know, the argument for effectively 75 years has been this notion of shared democratic values. And once a president and maybe even an entire party, and then at some point an entire country says, well, those aren't the things that matter, then as we're seeing from this trip, what advantage does Israel have over the Gulf states that seem to, you know, offer more at the moment in terms of transactions and in terms of interest? These are bigger countries in many ways with more capacity than Israel. They seem to have, at least in President Trump's conception, more to offer. And so once the shared values are off the table, then great, Israel's like any other country. So I think that, you know, there are going to be people who kind of are happy about minimizing the values clash that has existed, but ultimately that's not going to redound to Israel's benefit.
I'll just say that I think, you know, because President Trump is uh, unpredictable, things could change, right? And there's also a sentiment that's in the GOP pro-Israel camp. We see a letter, for instance, on the Iran issue, right? There's a letter from Congress on a warning against this deal with Iran. So I think on the substance issues, I don't think we're seeing the final word in terms of where this is going, but if I compare this, right, what happened here on October 7? President Biden came to Israel and gave Israel the full support and basically said, we're here for you and we're going to protect you. It's not that Trump is not doing that exactly, but I mean, this Houthi thing is basically saying, no, you're fine. You are left to your own. And what's more indicative is that there was a leak from the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, where Netanyahu said that it might be time to wean off the military assistance, the U.S. military assistance. Now, by the way, this is something I think should have happened a long time ago. I actually spoke about we spoke with Martin Indyk on an IPF webinar a few years ago, right? And it makes sense that Netanyahu would do it and will do it preemptively and not coming to this conversation. But it is sort of like letting go. I don't know if any other country, if Israel would be any other country, but it's not this sort of like mature custodianship. We are responsible for your security. I hope that's not the case. I do think the relationship needs to, you know, mature in a sense. It's not a bad thing, but and it's also Trump could be there's some more continuity on some issues than with others because the style is so different. But he's an aberration in other things, right? So we're going to go back to more traditional foreign policy or not. But I'll just give you even another anecdote that we're not talking about so much here. But you look at this AI, right? This thing in Saudi Arabia was a huge tech fest, right? This is sort of the future. And Israel, the tech prowess, right? This is where Israel's supposed to shine. And I think this is another criticism, right? We have Sam Altman and Jeff Bezos and all AI center is in the Gulf now, and Saudi is marking itself to be an AI leader. I don't know if you all know who's the vice minister in charge of AI in Israel. It's Almog Cohen. No disrespect, he might be a really nice person. I doubt that he can spell AI. So, you know, this is where, like, I think where Israel needs to, I don't think it's doomed, but I think Israel has to restore and show its added value and its asset value in the Middle East if it wants to continue receiving this U.S. support.
Well, thank you both for going overtime, and thanks everyone for staying overtime. Our plate was incredibly full for this webinar, and there's so much more to say about the Iran nuclear negotiations, about Qatar and its influence, and certainly about the humanitarian situation that we just began to touch on. There's so much more to talk about that and more, which we will, I am certain, in our next webinar sessions to come, our podcasts and content. I hope you're all continuing to follow. And just to plug this week's podcast on Israel Policy Pod is a conversation with former Ambassador Dennis Ross. I encourage everyone to check that out. And if you haven't read today's Koplow column, you're doing it wrong. Please do so at the end of this webinar. It is a must read. Thank you both to Michael and Shira. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you will continue to tune in for our next session. And of course, welcome you as always to become involved and join us in support of this important work. Thank you both. And thank you everyone for joining.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.